Her face bore marks of old wounds, reminders of hardships no one cared to remember but her. They ran across her skin in fine, pale lines, each telling a story of survival, of falls, of cruel hands, of accidents, of times when life tried to break her but failed. She wore these scars like an invisible garment, never flaunting them, never hiding them either. To her, they were not ugliness but evidence that she had endured. Though the world stared at them with whispers and judgment, she carried herself with dignity, moving quietly yet firmly, as if her scars were shields forged out of suffering. Villagers often turned to look when she passed, some with pity, others with disdain, but she never lowered her eyes. Her heart was steady, and her spirit still carried kindness, even when kindness had not been shown to her. When the time came for her to marry, she allowed herself to hope. She believed marriage would not only give her a home but also a chance to be seen beyond the surface of her skin. She dreamed of a husband who would recognize her strength, someone who would listen to her laughter and understand the quiet fire in her soul. Her mother's parting words echoed in her heart. "A scar is not shame, my daughter. It is proof you were stronger than the pain." Holding on to that wisdom, she walked into her marriage with fragile optimism, yearning for acceptance. Her beauty was undeniable, even if scars traced its edges. Her dark eyes held depth, her voice carried a gentleness that soothed those who truly listened, and her hands, though rough from work, held the tenderness of one who had endured without growing bitter. Her scars were part of her, but they did not diminish the light she carried. She brought gifts to her new home, small tokens of love, woven mats she had crafted, herbs she had gathered, and songs she had learned from her mother. With each gesture, she hoped to build warmth and belonging in her new household. At the wedding feast, she moved among the guests with quiet grace, serving food, offering smiles. Some whispered about the marks on her arms and face, but others noticed the way her presence calmed the air. She sang softly as the drums faded into the night, her song not one of sorrow but of hope. She wanted to believe the new chapter of her life would be different from the hardships of her past. The way she looked at her husband was filled with trust, as though she were ready to lay down all the burdens she had carried alone and share them with him. The elders of the village, too, spoke of her resilience. They remembered the little girl who had survived sickness when others had not, who had helped her widowed mother gather firewood when no one else offered aid, who had grown into a woman without ever turning her scars into excuses for cruelty. Even the children of the village admired her, following her when she went to fetch water, drawn to her soft laughter and the songs she would hum to ease their fears in the dark. To them, her scars were not frightening, they were part of her magic, a proof that she belonged to both pain and survival. In her heart, she nurtured the belief that love could grow even in difficult soil. She had endured the harshest storms of life, yet she carried the softness of someone who still wished to bloom. She entered her marriage with the quiet strength of one who has already fought many battles but still hopes for peace. Her eyes searched her husband's face for signs of kindness, for gentleness in his words, for recognition that she was more than the scars she bore. She longed for him to see the woman behind them, the dreamer, the giver, the survivor. The villagers often said that scars were curses, marks of punishment from the spirits, but she had never believed such talk. She knew her scars were her story, written on her skin like verses of endurance. In her husband's home, she prayed he would learn to read those verses with understanding rather than contempt. On the first night she lit the fire in their hut, she whispered a prayer to the ancestors, asking for love to root deeply, asking for her heart to finally find rest. The young woman carried both fragility and resilience, both fear and hope, but above all, she carried herself with dignity. She believed love could transform her scars into something sacred, something shared rather than hidden. Though the world may never stop whispering, she stepped into her new life as a bride with her head held high, believing that even a scarred soul deserves tenderness. And so, with hope bright as firelight, she waited for love to unfold. At first, she held on to the hope that marriage would soften her days. She rose before dawn, swept the compound, prepared his meals with care, and greeted him with the gentleness of a woman eager to build peace. But beneath her tenderness, her husband's heart was hard as stone. He did not look at her with admiration or gratitude. Instead, he let his eyes linger on the marks that life had carved into her skin. Where she saw proof of survival, he saw something to mock. His words, sharp as blades, cut deeper than any scar she carried, and soon the warmth she had hoped for turned to ash. In the privacy of their hut, he sneered when she tried to share her thoughts. "Who would want to listen to a face like yours speak?" he would mutter, turning away as though her very presence was a stain. She endured in silence, telling herself that patience might earn his respect. But patience only gave him more room for cruelty. Each day his disdain grew bolder, spilling from the walls of their home into the open air of the village. It began with subtle jabs when neighbors gathered, mocking jokes about how his wife's scars scared children, or how the firelight at night revealed her ugly truths. Laughter followed his words not because the villagers believed him, but because no one dared to confront a man in his own home. She stood frozen each time, her cheeks burning, but she refused to lower her head. Her dignity was her last defense. Soon his cruelty became spectacle. At feasts, when others danced and celebrated, he would drag her into the circle, pointing to the marks on her skin as if they were flaws to entertain others. "See here," he would laugh, "my wife carries maps on her body. Perhaps if you are lost, you can read her scars for direction." The crowd, uneasy yet eager to avoid his wrath, chuckled nervously. She stood there, feeling the weight of their eyes pierce her like arrows, every laugh another wound upon her spirit. Her hands trembled when she returned to the shadows, but she did not cry. Her tears had long been spent in younger years, when she still thought the world would be kinder. Now she wore her pain like armor, though inside, every word he spat cracked her heart. Each insult was a reminder that love, which she had dreamed would heal her, had instead sharpened the knife of cruelty. Even in the smallest of moments, he found ways to remind her she was unwanted. When she served him food, he would laugh and ask if the scars on her arms had fallen into the stew. When she fetched water, he would tell others that perhaps the river had scarred her because it could not bear her reflection. At night, when silence fell, his voice lingered in her mind, repeating the poison of his mockery. The villagers whispered among themselves, pitying her but never stepping forward. They saw her endurance, how she walked with straight shoulders even after nights of humiliation, but fear kept them silent. Some thought the husband's cruelty would one day return to him, for no spirit tolerated the breaking of an innocent soul without consequence. They watched her, wondering how long she could carry such wounds without breaking. What hurt her most was not the laughter of others, but the betrayal of the man she had trusted to see beyond her scars. She had entered the marriage believing in the possibility of love, only to find herself shackled to ridicule. Her scars had been written by fate, by trials beyond her control, but his words carved new wounds, fresh and raw, wounds that no healing balm could soothe. She began to grow silent, not because she accepted his cruelty, but because words seemed powerless against such venom. She poured her voice instead into the earth when she worked, singing softly to herself when no one could hear, reminding her own spirit that she was not as he described. Yet, beneath her quiet resilience, something stirred, an ember of anger, an awakening she could not yet name. His mockery did not only humiliate her, it planted a seed of reckoning in the soil of her soul. Night after night, she lay awake, staring at the roof of the hut, listening to his snores. Her heart whispered to her scars and her scars whispered back. They told her they were not shame. They told her they were strength. Each scar was a memory of survival, each mark a story of defiance against death itself. And if survival was carved into her very skin, then perhaps her scars carried a power he could not imagine. Still, her husband continued, blind to the storm he was provoking. His cruelty became his pride. He thought himself strong by making her weak. But he did not know that with every insult, every moment of public humiliation, he was shaping a fate that would one day turn against him. For her scars were not dead lines on her body. They were living things, and each cruel word fed them like fuel to a hidden fire. And as she endured, silent but unbroken, the world around them began to wait. The ancestors, the spirits, even the winds that moved through the village seemed to pause, holding their breath, knowing that no cruelty lasts forever without the earth answering back. She bore his cruel laughter like she had borne the fire that once left its marks upon her skin, with silence, with a stillness that both concealed and revealed her strength. Each word he hurled at her was meant to reduce her, to remind her of the imperfections carved into her flesh, yet she did not bend. Her face would not tremble, her eyes would not turn away, though her heart beat heavily beneath the weight of the ridicule. The villagers often gathered when he mocked her, their ears catching every sharp phrase, their eyes following her as if she were some tragic performance meant for their hidden judgments. Yet she did not raise her voice in anger or in defense. She stood there, scarred and silent, as though her scars themselves were her only reply. Her endurance became its own form of defiance. The women of the village whispered in corners, some pitying her, others thinking her foolish for not shouting back, for not leaving. The men smirked uneasily, uncomfortable with the cruelty yet unwilling to challenge it. And still she endured, walking about her daily tasks with her head held upright, collecting water from the stream, grinding grain at the mortar, tending to her small fire at dusk. Each scar, once a wound of flesh, had hardened into something that mirrored her spirit, unyielding and eternal. They told stories of her past suffering, of nights of pain and mornings of survival, but now they also told a new story, of the quiet refusal to be broken further. Her husband laughed loudest when she entered gatherings, pointing at the lines etched into her skin as though they were some shameful map. He drank with friends and used her scars as the punchline to his jokes. Yet each time she stood unmoving, looking at him with eyes that carried both grief and a depth that unsettled those who looked too long. The silence she chose was not born of weakness but of a waiting strength, though few understood this. They thought she allowed herself to be defeated. They thought her shame tied her tongue. But what they could not see was how her endurance reshaped the way her scars lived upon her. They were no longer reminders of her pain, they were the weapons being sharpened in patience. Children, in their innocence, sometimes reached to touch the scars along her arm or her cheek, and she let them. She smiled softly at them, letting them know that her skin did not carry shame, only history. To them she was not ugly nor broken. To them she was someone who had survived what others might never have endured. The children saw in her what the adults refused to, strength hidden in silence. And though the husband laughed, though his voice carried across the village square, she answered only with her quiet presence, which grew heavier by the day. At night, when the fire crackled low and her husband snored with drunken carelessness, she sat alone and let her silence become prayer. Her fingers touched the marks that ran across her arms, tracing them like the lines of a map leading to something yet to come. She thought of the ancestors, of the women who had suffered before her and endured, who had survived ridicule, hunger, violence, and exile. She whispered to them in the darkness, not with words but with the steady rhythm of her heart. Her silence became their silence, her patience their patience. She bore her scars as though she carried their blessings. The village, though outwardly silent, was never truly so. Behind closed doors and hushed voices they debated her. Some said she was too meek, that she should abandon him and walk away from such cruelty. Others claimed that her silence was dangerous, that it carried a power they could not name. For when they looked at her, they often found themselves unable to meet her gaze for long. There was something in her stillness, something in her refusal to collapse, that made them uneasy. It was as though she was not only enduring but also gathering something invisible to the eye, something that awaited its time to reveal itself. The seasons turned and her husband's mockery did not cease. Yet she endured. When the rains came and the roofs leaked, she endured. When the sun scorched the fields and thirst weighed heavy on the village, she endured. When laughter rose at her expense and the people did not come to her defense, she endured. In every act of endurance, her scars shifted in meaning, not blemishes of shame but emblems of survival. They became the silent truth etched upon her, a truth no mockery could erase. And so, her silence grew louder than his cruelty. Though she spoke no word, her endurance echoed through the village like a quiet drumbeat, steady and unbroken. The villagers began to sense it, though none dared say it aloud. The scars that he mocked were not weakness but warnings. They did not know that patience, once stretched too thin, transforms into reckoning. And though she remained silent, her endurance carried a promise that the silence would not last forever. His words grew sharper with each passing day, as though the taste of her humiliation had become his favorite meal. What began as sly remarks in their home, whispered just loud enough for her to hear, soon grew into bold and unrestrained mockery. At first, he mocked her scars only in moments of anger, flinging them like stones to break her composure. But soon he found pleasure in it, weaving ridicule into every breath, every gathering, every moment when others were near. Her body was no longer her own but a canvas upon which he painted his cruelty. He treated her flesh as if it were his property, its scars a weapon he alone had the right to expose. At feasts, where laughter and song should have lifted spirits, his voice cut through the music like a knife. "Behold my wife," he would announce, gesturing toward her as if she were a spectacle. "The woman who wears the map of every fire, every mistake, every curse upon her skin." His kin laughed nervously, some eager to join in, others too cowardly to resist. She sat at his side, her eyes lowered, though her silence was not submission but survival. Still, his laughter rang louder than her stillness. He loved the power of bending the crowd to his cruelty, making them laugh at wounds they themselves would never endure. Before kin, the cruelty deepened further. When his brothers and uncles gathered, he mocked her as if she were a rival warrior defeated by his wit. "A man's wife should be smooth as the river stone," he would say, raising his calabash of palm wine. but mine is carved with lines as though the spirits themselves used her as their clay." He would trace the air with his finger as though following invisible scars, exaggerating their depth, his kin roaring with false mirth. They drank on his words, their laughter hollow, their eyes betraying the unease they felt. Yet no one defended her. None dared, for to confront him was to break the harmony of the feast, to admit that cruelty had poisoned their gatherings. In private, his cruelty was quieter but sharper. When they were alone, he whispered his venom, stripping her dignity in the darkness. He taunted her as she lay by the fire, comparing her to the smooth-bodied girls of the village, mocking her silence as cowardice. "Do you think your quiet makes you strong?" he sneered one night. "It only proves what I say, that you are broken, that you are nothing." His words sought to dig deeper than any wound her body had once suffered. And yet she did not respond. She turned her silence into a shield, holding it before her as she had always done. The villagers began to notice. At first they turned away, telling themselves it was not their place. But as his cruelty grew, so did the weight of their silence. They watched her endure mockery after mockery, and some began to whisper in secret. The women muttered in the marketplace, shaking their heads as they exchanged baskets of millet. "He has gone too far," some said. "No man should strip his wife's dignity so openly." Yet even as they pitied her, they remained distant, unwilling to stand between the man and the woman he mocked. To them, the cruelty was a performance, one they could regret later but never interrupt in the moment. Her scars became more than flesh to the villagers. They became a story told again and again in whispers. The husband's mockery carried her wounds into every corner of the community, until even children heard fragments of it. They whispered questions to their mothers about the scarred woman, about the reason her husband laughed so loudly at feasts. And the mothers, uneasy, hushed them, not daring to explain cruelty that could not be excused. Each insult was a blade sharper than any wound she had known before. The fire that had once seared her body had burned only her flesh, but his laughter cut deeper, aiming for her spirit. Yet what he could not understand was that each cut, each cruel remark, only fed something inside her. Her silence was not emptiness, it was gathering strength, gathering rage, gathering memory. Every time he mocked her, her scars shifted their weight upon her skin, as though alive, as though waiting. She could feel it in her bones when he laughed, the subtle stirring of something beneath the surface, a power not yet unleashed. At the feasts, she noticed how the air shifted when his voice rose to mock her. The drums seemed to falter, the fire to flicker, as though even the spirits recoiled from his cruelty. She saw the unease in the eyes of the elders, though they said nothing. She saw the way the women looked at her, torn between pity and fear, as though they sensed something gathering behind her silence. And in the quiet of the night, when he taunted her in whispers, she felt her scars warm beneath her skin, glowing faintly like embers buried in ash. He thought his mockery made him strong, that it bound her in humiliation. But he was blind to what he was creating. Each insult became a stone in the foundation of his own downfall. Each cruel laugh became the rhythm of his undoing. For though she bore his words with silence, she was no longer simply enduring. She was becoming. Her scars, once wounds, had grown into marks of survival. And now, under the weight of his cruelty, they were shifting again, becoming something sharper, something that waited to be unleashed. The villagers began to sense it without knowing. They laughed when he demanded it, but their laughter no longer rang true. It faltered like a drum played offbeat. They felt the wrongness in the air, the heaviness that followed each insult. They began to glance at her with unease, as though her silence spoke louder than his words. Something stirred around her, and though they could not name it, they knew this. His cruelty had awakened more than shame. It had awakened a storm. At first, it came quietly, like a secret whispered only to her skin. In the stillness of the night, when the fire in the hearth had burned low and the laughter of the village had long faded, she began to feel it. A strange tingling stirred across the lines of her scars, faint as the brush of wind through tall grass. It was not pain, not the sharp sting of wounds reopening, but something deeper, as though the marks etched upon her flesh had never truly healed. They had been waiting. She lay awake on her mat, her husband's drunken snores filling the hut, and pressed her palm against her skin. The warmth pulsed beneath her touch, alive as though her scars themselves were breathing. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a dream clinging to her in the hours before dawn. But as the nights passed, the sensation grew stronger. Her scars tingled like embers hidden in ash, spreading from her arms to her chest, then down her legs. Sometimes, she thought she saw faint lines of light trace across her body, vanishing the moment she tried to hold her gaze. The air around her grew heavier, thick with something unseen, as though the night itself leaned in to listen to the rhythm of her body. By day she tried to hide it. When her husband mocked her in front of others, she kept her silence as always, her head bowed, though now her silence carried a weight she herself could not yet explain. Her scars itched beneath her clothes, tingled as though they longed to answer him, but she pressed her lips tight and endured. Still, she could not stop the sense that something was awakening in her, a force that was not entirely hers yet bound to her as surely as her own breath. One night, as she sat alone outside the hut while her husband drank with his kin, she felt the tingling sharpen into fire. She looked down at her arms and for the first time she did not imagine it. Her scars glowed faintly in the moonlight, threads of pale fire winding across her skin like hidden rivers of flame. She gasped, clutching her arms to her chest, her eyes darting to the darkness of the trees. For a moment, fear gripped her. Was this a curse? Had her scars become a brand that marked her for the spirit's wrath? But then she felt it. The warmth was not cruel, not searing. It was steady, like a mother's hand pressed against her cheek. A calmness spread through her chest, stronger than the fear. She closed her eyes, listening, and in the silence she thought she heard a murmur, low and ancient, rising from within the glow. It was not words but a presence, a hum that resonated with her heartbeat. The scars that had been her shame, the marks that her husband mocked and used to humiliate her, were no longer silent. They were speaking now, speaking in fire. The nights grew stranger. Animals avoided her path, even when she carried nothing but water from the stream. Dogs barked as she passed but did not dare approach. Children whispered about seeing her skin flicker with light, though their mothers quickly hushed them, telling them not to speak of such things. Even the elders, when she walked by, shifted uneasily, as though they sensed something moving in the air around her. She too began to sense the change. When she closed her eyes at night, visions flickered in the darkness, flashes of fire, blades glinting, shadows falling. She felt her scars tighten when her husband mocked her, as though they yearned to strike back. Once, when he raised his hand to her in anger, she flinched not in fear but in anticipation, her skin burning so hot that he recoiled before his palm could touch her. He stared at her then, suspicion narrowing his drunken eyes, but he said nothing. He only turned away muttering, though she could see the unease in his face. The villagers began to whisper, though never in her hearing. They spoke of the way the air changed when she entered a gathering, how flames flickered strangely when she sat by the fire. Some said they had seen her scars glow like moonlight, others claimed it was only drink and fear playing tricks on their sight. But none could deny that something was shifting, something tied to the scars she bore. The scars that had once been ridiculed now seemed to carry a force that unsettled them all. Alone in the night, she began to test it. She pressed her hand to the ground, focusing on the hum she felt in her scars, and sometimes the earth trembled faintly beneath her palm. She whispered without words, her lips unmoving, and flames in the fire pit would bend toward her as though listening. Each experiment filled her with awe and fear in equal measure. Was this a gift from the spirits, or a curse meant to consume her? She did not know, but she felt something inside her shift each time. The scars were no longer just reminders of pain, they were conduits of power. The glow grew stronger with each night, faint lines burning brighter until they could not be ignored. Once, she caught sight of herself in the river's surface and gasped at the reflection. Her body traced with glowing marks like the etchings of a warrior's blade. For the first time she did not see herself as broken. She saw herself as forged. Every scar was a blade, sharpened and waiting, a part of her that no one could mock into silence. Her husband, though still cruel, began to falter in his laughter. He noticed the way her scars glimmered in the firelight, though no one else seemed to see it so clearly. He noticed the way her silence had grown heavier, less like submission and more like a storm holding itself back. His mockery grew louder, harsher, as though he could drown the power rising in her by shouting it down. But the louder he became, the more her scars burned beneath her skin, and the stronger her resolve grew. She no longer feared her scars. For the first time since her body had been marked, she understood. They were not signs of weakness, not chains of shame. They were keys to something greater, something awakening with every cruel word he uttered. The scars he mocked were becoming his undoing. And though the power was still stirring, still waiting, she knew it would not be long before the fire in her skin spoke for itself. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, the change creeping into her body like dawn creeping over the horizon. For nights she had felt the tingling, the warmth, the glow of her scars, but now something more was stirring. She woke in the middle of the night, breath caught in her throat, her skin alive as though 1,000 fires burned just beneath it. She sat up, staring down at her arms, and saw her scars flare brighter than ever before, lines of light burning so fiercely that they seemed carved into her flesh anew. The warmth turned sharp, electric, and she gasped as her scars hardened beneath her skin, their edges no longer soft reminders of old wounds but sharp, defined, as though steel had grown where once there had been pain. Each scar was transforming. The long line across her forearm blazed like a blade freshly pulled from the forge, its glow stretching outward until she thought she could actually see the shimmering edge of a weapon hanging in the air, invisible and yet undeniable. The faint marks on her back shifted, each one rising in the air behind her like ghostly blades, invisible unless the light struck just right, but their weight pressed upon her, heavy and solid. She touched the old burned scar along her shoulder, and sparks danced between her fingers, the scar responding like metal striking flint. At first she panicked, clutching herself, unsure if she was breaking apart. But as she sat there in the dark hut, the sensation settled into something deeper, steadier. She realized it was not destruction, it was transformation. The scars were not wounds anymore. They were weapons, each one forged in the furnace of her suffering. Every insult, every mockery, every time she had endured humiliation had fed them. And now they were awake. When she stood, she could feel them moving with her, a silent arsenal strapped to her soul. Some scars gleamed faintly, visible as luminous etchings on her skin, glowing like thin blades of light. Others had no glow at all, but she felt them nonetheless, sharp, invisible, dangerous. They sliced through the air as she raised her hand, a faint shimmer trailing where her scarred wrist bent. She stepped outside, the cool night air meeting her blazing body, and the world seemed to bend slightly, as if the spirits themselves recognized her new form. The moonlight fell across her face, and in its reflection on the water she saw herself transformed. Not the scarred, mocked woman her husband had jeered at, not the quiet, ridiculed bride who bore insults in silence, but something more. Her body carried stories in each mark, her back a shield of suffering, her arms lined with glowing blades, her legs traced with the cuts of survival, now sharpened into weapons no one could take from her. She turned her hand, and the scar that once burned her palm stretched outward, forming what looked like the hilt of a dagger made of pure light. She gripped it instinctively and the dagger hummed, alive. The air shifted around her, whispering with energy. The leaves rustled though no wind blew. Dogs howled in the distance, their cries laced with unease. It was as if the entire world could feel her scars taking shape, their power cutting not just through her flesh but through the very balance of things. For every scar was more than skin, it was memory. Each carried the echo of a wound, the weight of pain she had been forced to endure. Now that pain had become its own form of justice, sharpened into edges that waited only for her will to guide them. She tested one, raising her arm slowly. The glowing line down her forearm extended outward, invisible but heavy, humming with sharpness. She swung it tentatively, and the air cracked as though she had sliced it open. A tree branch several feet away snapped cleanly, falling to the ground in silence. She staggered back, staring at what she had done. The scar dimmed again, waiting as if listening for her command. Trembling, she looked at the branch, then at her own body. The scars were hers, and yet they had become something else, something far greater than human flesh could contain. Her husband stirred inside the hut, muttering in drunken sleep, and she froze. For a heartbeat she considered what it would mean to turn these blades upon him now, to let her scars answer all the cruelty he had poured into her life. Her arms ached with the temptation, but she held back. Not yet. The power was still new, still raw. She needed to understand it, to learn it, to become one with it. If she struck now, it would be rage alone guiding her, and rage was too wild a master. But she could not deny the thrill that ran through her veins. For the first time in her life, her scars no longer chained her. They armed her. She felt taller, stronger, her breath deeper, her eyes brighter. She walked across the clearing with her back straighter than it had ever been, each step firm, each scar humming faintly with readiness. The villagers, though asleep, would soon feel it. She knew the stories would begin again, the whispers about the strange woman whose scars glowed in the night, whose presence bent the air. But this time she would not lower her head in shame. This time she would not silence herself or endure mockery. Her scars were blades, and blades did not bow. She pressed her hand once more against her arm, feeling the faint hum of the weapon beneath her skin. A tear slid down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was relief, recognition. She finally understood. Everything she had endured, every insult, every wound, none of it had been in vain. Her scars had been carved into her so that she might rise forged, remade, unbreakable. And though her husband and the village had mocked her, they would soon tremble at the truth. The very scars they despised had become the blades that would cut them down. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against the walls of a hut and makes the flames of a small fire flicker uneasily. Her husband sat cross-legged, his gourd of palm wine in hand, his eyes bleary yet sharp with the familiar venom that had cut her down so many nights before. He looked at her, his gaze crawling across her face, down to her arms where the faint glow of her scars still lingered from the day's strange awakening. Instead of awe or fear, he smirked, his lips curling into the cruel line she had come to dread. "You think those marks make you special?" he slurred, his voice dripping with mockery. "You were born ugly and life carved you uglier still. Each scar is a brand of shame. You think I chose you? No, I was cursed with you. You're nothing but a vessel for misfortune, a patchwork of wounds no man should call a wife." He spat the words like poison, his laughter echoing in the small space. The sting of his voice cut deeper than knives, and for a moment she felt that old ache, the weight of humiliation pressing on her chest. But then something shifted. The scars along her arms, her back, her legs began to burn, not with pain but with power. Their glow intensified, brightening the hut in pulses of light that seemed alive. Her husband frowned, his laughter faltering as the air thickened, charged with something unnatural. The scar along her forearm flared, its line of light stretching outward until the shimmer of a blade extended from her skin, invisible yet humming with sharpness. The marks on her back flickered, rising behind her like spectral swords, fanning out like wings made of steel and memory. The small scar at her collarbone sparked, and from it rose a thin, curved dagger of light, floating as though suspended by unseen hands. He stumbled back, his eyes widening, the drunken haze clearing in an instant. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "What trick are you playing, woman?" But it was no trick. She rose to her feet, taller than he had ever seen her, her body surrounded by a halo of blades formed from every scar he had mocked, every wound he had turned into ridicule. They hovered around her, glowing faintly, the air buzzing with the sharpness of their edges. Her eyes burned not with tears this time, but with fire, the reflection of power reclaimed. "You called them shame," she said, her voice low but steady, carrying an echo that made the walls quiver. "But these scars are my strength. Each one is a story of survival. Each one is a weapon forged from the pain you gave me." He shook his head violently, retreating until his back pressed against the far wall of the hut. The shadows from the glowing blades danced across his face, stretching his fear into grotesque shapes. His breath quickened, his hand tightening around the gourd as if he could use it for protection. "Stay back," he barked, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. But the scars did not obey him. They obeyed her. The blade along her forearm slashed outward, cutting through the air with a sound like tearing cloth. A wooden stool by the fire split in half, its pieces collapsing with a sharp crack. He cried out, his eyes darting between the ruined stool and the wife he had once called worthless. She stepped forward, each movement fluid, her scars blazing brighter, the weapons they had become circling her like guardians, or executioners. "Do you remember," she asked softly, though her voice filled the room, "the nights you mocked me before the village? Do you remember the way you laughed as if my pain were a feast? Do you remember turning my body into a spectacle for your pride?" Her words fell heavy, and with each one another blade ignited, hovering in the air. Soon the hut was alive with their glow, a storm of edges shimmering, each scar recalling a wound, each wound recalling a cruelty. He dropped to his knees, his pride cracking under the weight of terror. "Enough," he pleaded, his hands trembling. "You're my wife, my wife. I meant no harm. They were only words." Her scars pulsed, humming in unison as if answering him with disdain. She took another step closer, and the air sliced where she moved, unseen blades brushing against him. His tunic tore along the sleeve, though her hand had not touched him. A line of blood appeared on his arm, shallow but real. He gasped, staring at it as if it were the mark of death itself. "They were never just words," she said, her voice hardening, her eyes glowing like coals. "Every insult you hurled at me became a wound, and every wound became this. You mocked me with laughter, but tonight your laughter ends." The blades vibrated, their hum growing louder, filling the night with the sound of vengeance awakening. She raised her arm, and the weapons shifted, aligning themselves toward him, ready to strike. He screamed, stumbling forward, groveling at her feet. "Mercy! Forgive me, forgive me!" His voice cracked, his body shaking as sweat poured down his face. But for her there was no fear left, no weakness. The woman he had mocked was gone. In her place stood something born of suffering, a bride whose scars had transformed into blades of justice. The blades hung in the air, waiting only for her command, while he knelt trembling, knowing the night of his mockery had become the night of his reckoning. And as the moonlight filtered through the cracks of the hut, falling upon her glowing scars, it seemed the very earth held its breath, waiting to see if she would let the blades fall. The night of reckoning came like a storm cloaked in silence. Her husband, swollen with the arrogance that had always marked him, sneered at her in the half-light of their hut. His voice carried the same venom it always had, but that night it was weaker, trembling at the edges though he did not notice. He mocked her scars, calling them ugly reminders of weakness, and laughed at the woman who had endured so much yet still stood before him. But the words that once pierced her spirit now bounced off a shield wrought of something far more powerful than he could fathom. For as he spoke, the scars he despised began to stir, gleaming faintly in the glow of the fire. Each one shimmered like molten metal drawn from a forge, each one alive with a power that had been tempered by pain, suffering, and endurance. The first blade unfurled along her forearm, thin and sharp as a spear's edge, glinting with a faint red hue. He stopped mid-sentence, his laughter faltering as his eyes widened. Another scar along her shoulder burned and twisted, elongating into a glimmering dagger that seemed to slice the air itself. More followed, from her legs, her back, her chest, each scar becoming a weapon, a memory turned steel. Some blades were visible, shimmering like molten silver. Others were invisible, felt only in the sudden shifts of air, the whispers of unseen edges circling around her. She stood taller now, her quiet strength unfolding into something magnificent and terrible. Her husband stumbled back, clutching at his chest as though he could anchor himself to courage he no longer had. He tried to speak, but his words cracked in his throat, lost beneath the low hum of energy filling the room. The air itself grew heavy, the hut's walls trembling with the weight of the transformation. His hands shook as he pointed at her, but even his accusations faltered. For the first time he was not the master of the room. He was not the voice that commanded. He was prey. The first strike came not from her hand but from the memory of his cruelty. A blade swept past his face, so close it sliced a lock of hair from his temple. He yelped and fell backward, his pride wounded before his flesh was touched. Another blade swirled past his arm, cutting through the sleeve of his robe, leaving a shallow mark beneath. He staggered, the sting more humiliating than painful, but the realization settled over him. This was not a wife, not a woman to be mocked and diminished. This was judgment given form. He tried to flee, stumbling toward the doorway, but the blades moved faster than his steps. They whirled around him like a storm of knives, their edges singing with her pain, her silence, her endurance. One blade cut across his cheek, shallow yet burning with the weight of every insult he had cast at her. Another struck his leg, not enough to cripple, but enough to send him sprawling to the ground. His cries rang out into the night, raw and shrill, the sound of a man watching his power crumble. Desperate, he reached for a spear resting by the wall, his final show of strength. But as he lifted it, one of her scars burst into a blade longer and sharper than any weapon he had ever held. It slashed through the spear's wooden shaft as though it were dry grass, snapping it in two. The pieces clattered to the floor, leaving him defenseless. He crawled then, his dignity shattered, his pride bleeding into the earth beneath him. "Mercy," he gasped, his voice cracking with a fear he had never known. He begged the very woman he had ridiculed, his words dripping with desperation, no longer sharp or mocking but broken. Yet she did not need to answer. Her scars spoke for her. The blades closed in, circling him tighter, pressing the air against his chest. His eyes darted from one glowing edge to another, realizing with each passing moment that every insult, every cruel laugh, every humiliation had only forged another weapon. Every scar on her body was a record of his cruelty, and now they had come alive to repay him. The final strike was not one of rage but of balance. A blade arched from her chest, striking him squarely across his own heart. He gasped, his body convulsing as the wound opened, not just in flesh but in spirit. His cries turned to silence as his body slumped to the ground, lifeless and still. Around her, the blades shimmered before dissolving back into scars upon her skin. The hut grew quiet again, save for the crackle of the fire. She stood over his body, breathing steadily, her eyes calm, her spirit unshaken. He had mocked her scars, called them ugly and worthless. But in the end, those same scars had risen as her strength, her weapons, her justice. The village would later whisper about that night, some saying they heard his screams from across the fields, others claiming they saw the glow of blades dancing in the dark. But all knew the truth, that the scars of the woman once mocked had become the very blades that cut down her tormentor. His power was gone, his cruelty silenced, and her strength left etched in the memory of every villager who had once turned away. The night after his death, the village did not sleep. Whispers moved through the huts like restless winds, each retelling twisting with awe and dread. Men who had once laughed along with her husband now pressed their lips together, afraid even to speak her name too loudly. Women who had pitied her suffering shivered at the thought of her scars, which they once saw as blemishes but now recognized as marks of something divine and dangerous. Children huddled close to their mothers, warned to stay inside, for no one knew whether her new power could spread beyond the walls of her hut. When dawn broke, no one dared to approach her home. The man who had mocked her lay lifeless inside, his body still and cold, yet no one volunteered to bury him. His relatives whispered among themselves, torn between duty and terror, afraid that if they touched him, the blades that had ended his life might awaken again. At last, 2 of the bravest men carried his body out, but even they trembled, their eyes never daring to meet hers. They laid him in the earth quickly, without songs, without mourning, as though burying not a man but a curse. Every villager remembered their own silence. They remembered how they had watched her humiliation and done nothing. They remembered how they had lowered their eyes when her husband ridiculed her scars in public, choosing laughter or silence over defense. Now that their silence had been broken by the sharp edge of her power, guilt gnawed at their hearts. Yet the guilt was bound up with fear, for who could say whether her blades would someday turn against them? The marketplace, once noisy with chatter and laughter, grew quieter in her presence. When she walked among the stalls, people stepped aside, clearing paths as though she carried a storm around her. Some lowered their heads, not from respect but from fear that her gaze might summon a blade. Others whispered prayers under their breath, asking the ancestors to shield them from the wrath of the scarred woman. Her scars had become more than marks of pain, they were symbols of power, and power was never trusted by those who had once ignored it. Mothers told their daughters to respect her but not to get too close. Fathers warned their sons not to speak of her beauty, lest admiration be mistaken for insult. Children stared with wide eyes when she passed, then scurried away as if afraid her shadow might cut them. She had become both a figure of reverence and of terror, one whose presence reminded the entire village of what cruelty could awaken. Even the elders, who once upheld the customs that allowed her husband to mock her without consequence, began to tremble in her presence. They met in secret, debating what should be done. Some argued that she must be honored, given offerings, treated like one touched by spirits. Others insisted she was dangerous, that no human should wield such power unchecked. But none dared to confront her openly. Their authority, once unquestioned, faltered before the sight of the woman whose scars had turned into weapons. At night the village changed. Fires burned lower, doors were barred earlier, and every creak of the wind carried unease. Some claimed to hear the hum of unseen blades in the darkness. Others swore they saw faint lights dancing on her skin when the moonlight touched her. No one dared to test whether these were illusions or truths. Fear, once a quiet undercurrent, had become the soul of the village. Yet beneath the fear was something deeper, awe. For though they trembled, they also understood that she had endured what none of them could. Where they had cowered in silence, she had risen in strength. Where they had let cruelty fester, she had forged justice from her wounds. Her scars told a story not just of suffering but of power, and that story unsettled them, for it showed that their silence had not gone unnoticed. Thus, the people began to whisper of her not as a victim, not even as a widow but as something greater. Some called her a living curse, others a spirit of vengeance. A few dared to call her blessed, saying that the ancestors themselves had chosen her to reveal the hidden strength of pain. But all agreed on one thing: she was untouchable. No man would dare claim her. No woman would dare defy her. And no child would forget her image when they closed their eyes at night.